time dragged, the wood only half gone. Michel stood up and stepped to the north end of camp. It was a moonless night with still air. She took a deep breath and stared into inky blackness. The night cooled her fire-warmed face, and she listened to tiny nibbling sounds in a nearby bush. Other than that intrusion, the night was silent. Michel looked up into a star-filled sky. She turned slowly in a tight circle, her eyes always on the sky. After 2 revolutions, she stopped. Vertigo forced a stumbling step, but she continued to stare upward. She whispered, "Some day I will have a lover, and we'll lie naked on soft fleece and study the stars. Naked, naked, naked." The young girl's attention shifted to the horizon at her left. The half-circle of a luminary pulse glowed and faded away. Wow, that was big. Approximately 20 degrees to the right, another pulse expanded and faded. They're like little suns. Michel shuddered and gripped her stomach. Oh no. Another bloomed with the perfect symmetry, smaller and apparently farther away. Michel walked calmly to where the men slept and gently woke them. She whispered, "You have to see this." Another glow expanded like a giant balloon and shortly deflated. The men quickly rose to their feet. Justin raised his hands to his temples. Paul stared in bewilderment. What the hell was that? Michel spoke in a shaky voice. "It wasn't the first." Justin gasped. His arms fell to his sides. "How many have there been?" She nodded toward the west. "That was the 4th. She paused. "I think the biggest, or maybe it was just closer." Paul pointed. 4? 4 of those? He turned to his father. "Explosions? A refinery? An old ammo dump?" To the west the sky brightened, but no sphere of light showed. "No, Paul. They're throwing missiles around." He shook his head. "Fat boys." Paul squinted. "Fat boys?" Justin took a breath. "It's not important." He put his jacket on and stepped a few paces away from the fire. "They're doing it. The idiots are doing it. The goddamned idiots." He shook his head. Michel, still clutching her stomach, turned to the north. "I wonder how far to the north they were." She spun around to Justin. "Do you think they hit Oregon?" A dim light appeared and faded far to the north. Michel had not seen it. "Perhaps." He paused. "Oh, hell, how would I know?" He walked back to his sleeping bag. "Is this really happening?" He sat down and studied the horizon with anticipation. Michel sat next to him. "What do we do?" Paul stood near the fire. "Well, we don't go west or north." Another mini-sun rose in the east and evaporated. Justin thought out loud. "Government installations are probably the targets. We should be safe." He lowered his head. "Any place near a glow will be contaminated." He turned to the south. "I didn't see anything happen that way." He turned back to his children. "Did either of you see anything that way?" Paul shook his head. "No, nothing to the south." Justin looked at Michel. "No, not that way." She rose to her feet. "That's good. We can still go that way, right?" Paul put his back to the fire. "What about the stuff blowing in the wind?" Justin stroked his beard. The South will still be the safer place. Weather moves to the east in general, or at least it did. An hour passed without further incident. Paul assumed the watch. Michelle and Justin sat at the fire, and sleep evaded all. As the real sun rose, smoke rose in the north and west, but not much. Justin got up and walked to where Paul stared into the north. He put his hand on his son's shoulder. "I guess it's over." He looked to the east. "I don't think we're in danger." Michelle came to their side. "I couldn't sleep at all." She rubbed her eyes and her posture slumped. "Is there any tea?" Paul turned a dreary face. "Yeah, the pot's full." Michelle returned to the fire. Paul still stared into the north. "Well, Dad, one thing's for sure. Your dead friend sent us in the right direction." Justin wasn't cheered. Suddenly uncomfortable with his idealism, he exhausted a deep breath. His head throbbed and he mused. "But why? I forgot the why." Justin returned to the fire and the hot tea. He poured himself tea and went to his sleeping bag with tortured thoughts. "I've forgotten something. Life must be more than the growing of meat." He could feel the strength draining from him. He rolled to his back and spoke in a loud voice. "Leave me be. Don't talk to me unless it's important." He rolled back to his side, closed his eyes, and was instantly consumed by a dream. A small man raced through his mind in search for a certain something. He checked a place, and no, it wasn't there. The little man's body shivered with a need and a panic that prevented clear thought. "Where the fuck is it?" The little man took tiny, fearful steps in a giant empty city. What the fuck was the reason? What the fuck is the question? The little man found a dark cranny heaped high with garbage. He crawled beneath the pile. "I'll wait. It will come to me. It will be given back." All went still. All went blank. Justin slept in his sleeping. The group stayed where they were, their father tucked into a tight, fetal position in his wish to be alone, and they sat at the fire and mused about the strange life they lived. The sun descended below the horizon, and the children prepared for the night. They divided the watch between themselves. It was a restless, uncomfortable night. In the light of the second morning, Paul and Michelle sat at the fire, a cup of tea in hand. Justin stood to the east, a black shadow before the shimmering red sun. "We need to move on." Within an hour, the small group recommenced their journey southward at a slow walk, Paul in the lead and his father at the middle. Justin periodically shut his eyes for short moments. Oregon was no longer a consideration. The Dead Man's Settlement was now their only option. At the hottest point of the day, Justin straightened with an unexpected remembrance. It soured his mood. It came from years back, a beating he had taken as a small boy from his drunken father. He recalled the deep-toned command and the gin-soaked breath. "Come closer." He knew what the command really meant. It meant, "I can't reach you." He took that step, and he remembered the fear and the warm urine. He remembered the pain of the blow and the relief at its completion. Justin raised his head to his son's back. He murmured to himself, "My father called me closer." Justin took a deep breath and spun to face Michelle. "You know that things happen the way they're supposed to." Michelle halted at mid-stride. Justin spoke in a loud voice. "I called the bomb throwers assholes. Well, somebody has to be the asshole." Justin blinked and dropped to one knee. His head swam in a surge of dizziness. His stomach cramped and his mouth oozed saliva. Paul turned. "Are you all right, Dad?" Justin ignored the question and spat into the dust. "I love my father. He gave me what I needed." Michelle looked at Paul, bewilderment written across her face. Justin studied the round, flattened glob of spit now lightly coated with dust. He stood up, stepped on it, and looked up into the sky. "Change needs to take place." He stepped around Paul. "And it's important as to how it occurs." He looked into the sky. "And who am I to fucking argue?" He turned once again toward his children. "I forgot about the need for the bad guys. And when all is done, they may well be considered heroes." He turned and walked on. Paul shrugged his shoulders and moved after his father. Immediately Michelle reached out and held him back. She shook her head, and Paul relaxed. The day passed with little conversation. As they were together, so were they apart. Chapter 12. Little Pond. Nicole. A world event of nuclear war occurred near midnight of the second day while Nicole and her family huddled in the shelter at Ravens in the Sky. Now the resurrected women trekked to the south, seeking salvation at another settlement. They were sure of its existence. They had seen people from the place. They carried a meager supply of food and some equipment for catching small game and fish. A magnifying glass and matches provided fire. Their weapons consisted of 3 knives, a spear, and a pistol with 5 bullets. Nicole stood before the girls. "The settlement is somewhere to the south. We'll go all the way to the Gulf and move east." She eyed each of her daughters. "There's supposed to be some sort of new inland sea, perhaps part of the Gulf." Shemaine's eyes widened and she leaned forward. "All the way to the Gulf?" She turned to her sister, her head bobbing. "All the way to the Gulf." Nicole picked up her pack. "If anybody has a better idea, please let me know." The sun blazed on the eastern horizon. "In the mornings we'll keep the sun to our left. At noon it'll be overhead, and then to our right as the day ends." She took her first step south. "The weather will be hot, so we'll rest through the midday." Shemaine shouldered her pack. "Like the man said, 1 step leads to 1,000,000. Hot, dull days rolled by. Wild food presented itself from time to time, mostly berries and nuts. The occasional orchard or field growing artifacts from past farming days offered welcomed gifts. At other times they halted to trap animals, and on one occasion killed a crippled deer with the last bullets in the revolver. What they couldn't eat, they cooked and carried. The trail south settled into an uneventful physical struggle. Each day started with a small meal and a drink of water, after which Nicole hoisted her pack, looked at the sun, and commenced the walking. The girls mindlessly followed with little conversation. Nicole always took the lead and spent most of her day alone. Outwardly, Nicole functioned efficiently. Inwardly, deeply stressed. Her mind sometimes swirled with mild hallucinations. The glaring light troubled her eyes, and the heat drained her energy. Each day, at midday, when she saw her shadow as a small circle around her feet, she'd mindlessly wave her hand, and all three stumbled to the nearest shade. The midday resting periods nearly always ended the same way. Automatically, Nicole's eyes opened, and she'd stand, pick up her pack, walk to the girls, and nudge them with her foot. Robot-like, the girls stood and resumed walking. Naively, Shemaine and Julia drew heavily from Nicole's inner strength, oblivious to her near exhaustion. Out of habit, they delegated the responsibility for their existence to their mother. A well from which they had always drunk, they never considered its limitations. Now they followed her, pulled by the phantom umbilical cords, their minds dulled, giving relief from the surrounding stress. Eventually, Nicole saw the futility of her effort. At mid-morn of a hot day, she stopped and slowly turned to face her daughters. They approached with labored steps. Nicole spoke in a timid, weak voice. "You have to help." The girls trudged by, oblivious to her presence. Nicole sucked a quick, feeble breath, and then, angered, her voice suddenly sharpened. "I need your help." The girls halted and turned. Nicole scrutinized their blank, sullen eyes. Her breathing came in tiny breaths. She gazed down at her feet, and two small stones, one pale red and the other pale blue. The clarity of the sight appeared to float the stones above the soil. Julia stumbled from her standing position and kicked a billow of dust into Nicole's field of vision, obscuring the pretty stones. Nicole's head snapped to an upright position, her blue eyes transfixed on Julia intently. Lazy eyes stared back from the girl's wobbling head, and she whispered lethargically, "I do that." Nicole dropped her spear and pack, but never took her gaze off Julia. She stepped forward. Her left hand grabbed the leather of the girl's shirt just below her right shoulder. Holding her in that position, she called to Shemaine. "Shemaine, come here." Shemaine shuffled to her sister's side. Nicole grabbed her clothing with her right hand just above the breasts. "Shemaine, Shemaine, wake up." She jerked Julia back and forth. "We're dying." Julia's head nodded with the force. Her eyes fluttered, and her pack fell to the ground. Nicole turned back to Shemaine and shook her with greater force. "We're dying, and you're letting it happen." The girls lingered in numbness, their heads bobbing as if on rubbernecks. Nicole's anger escalated to fury. The mother released her grip, and with unrestricted force she struck. She hit Shemaine in the mouth with the palm of her hand. The same hand came back and struck Julia in the nose. "You fools! Wake up! You have to wake up! Now!" The girls staggered away from their mother. Their eyes cleared, and they raised their hands in defense. Nicole persisted with the onslaught, pushing Shemaine, causing her to stumble backwards. She shoved Julia, and the girl tripped over her own pack and fell on her bottom, red liquid dribbling across her lips. Nicole screamed, "Are you awake? Can you hear me?" Jarred out of their stupor, the girls simultaneously lunged at their mother. Julia stubbed her toe on a rock and fell against Nicole's knees. Shemaine grabbed Nicole's right arm as it touched Julia's back. Pulling to the right caused Nicole to fall sideways. Nicole's left arm swung around and seized Shemaine's hair. All three went to the ground in a billow of dust. Nicole released Shemaine's hair, and the girl quickly rose to her knees and straddled her mother. She sucked a breath in order to shout, but gagged on the dust floating in the air. She held Nicole's right arm to the ground as she spat and sputtered. Julia rolled away from the pile and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Dust, mixed with blood, smeared her face. She rose to her feet and stomped to her mother's side. "What in the hell are you doing?" Shemaine released Nicole's arm and stood up. She looked down at her mother, but spoke to her sister. "I think she's gone mad." Nicole sat up and hunched forward. Her right hand waved in front of her eyes, dispatching the dust. "I'm mad, all right." She shooed them. "Move back so I can get up." The girls obeyed, and Nicole stood. Her head shook. "I'm not insane. I'm pissed." Nicole looked at the bloodied, blotched faces, and her anger diminished. "We're dying, and you two drag along. I can't carry either of you." Shemaine spat more dust from her mouth. "I don't know what you're talking about." Nicole ignored the statement and walked past the girls, seeking the canteen of water. She shouted over her shoulder. "You both think of little else other than yourselves. You're childish, unthinking parasites. You take and you give nothing back." Shemaine and Julia looked at each other in bewilderment. Nicole, with the water in hand, moved to the shade of a tree and sat down. "I will no longer carry the load myself. I'm drained." She looked directly at them. "We're dying." A tear ran across Julia's dusty face. "I'm tired, too." She spat some blood. "This hell won't end." Nicole ignored her. "From this moment on, you will not only be expected to carry your share, you'll be expected to seek out your share." She paused and her tone mellowed. "You must grow up. You must be women. And it has to be now." Shemaine glared. "You slap us around without a word of warning and tell us to grow up?" She stood up, her palms up and outstretched. "What's going on?" Her hands went to her side. "Did I miss something?" Julia licked some of the blood off her lip. "You're being unfair. We're doing our best. There's no need for all of this." Her eyes slowly closed halfway, and she clenched her teeth. "I hate all of this." Nicole followed the girl with her eyes. "Together, we have strength, not as one and a group of two." She took a drink of water. "We can get through this." Shemaine sneered. "Get through this? To what? Tigers to fight?" Julia sat in the shade of another tree. "It reminds me of the song, 'The Bear Went Over the Mountain.'" Shemaine concurred. "Exactly." Nicole's head nodded. Okay. He saw another mountain. But what do? Refuse to climb the mountain? Sit down and die?" She took another drink of water. "I can't carry you over the mountain." Long moments of silence ensued. Finally, Nicole rose to her feet. "Right." She took a deep breath. "Let's find that settlement. We know it exists, and we know just about where it is." Nicole retrieved her pack and started to walk to the south. She felt better. She felt stronger. She raised an arm into the sky. "Matthew was right. We are special. There is something for us to do. All this is not for nothing." Her head dropped, and she whispered her own encouragement. There has to be a reason for all this shit. There has to be. The girls watched their mother walk away. Julia stood up. She didn't have to slap us around. There was no need for that. I can carry my own load, and part of hers as well. She picked up her pack, her eyes alert, and she strode after her mother. Shemaine quickly stepped to her sister's side. I still think she's gone a bit mad. She took a few more steps. But it would be great to find that settlement. I was told that it was a lot better equipped than Ravens in the Sky, and full of educated people, artists, scientists. I heard that they even have an orchestra. I heard that too, but I don't believe it. Julia smirked. Do you think we're special? Shemaine smirked in return. Sure we are. That's why we have all this good stuff. God really likes us. She pushed her sister away. In the following days, the trio moved with greater efficiency. Their morale improved. During these travails, Nicole kept an approximate estimate of the distance traveled. When sure they were in New Mexico, she decided to inform the girls at the evening meal. Nicole tossed a rabbit bone over her shoulder and wiped her hands on her trousers. Listen up. Sitting on a stone, she leaned forward, placing her elbows on her knees. I've been keeping track of the distance we've covered. Of course, it's only an estimate, but I'm sure we're in New Mexico. A confident smile brightened her face. She leaned back and clapped her hands. Her eyes shifted from one daughter to the other. Good news, huh? Shemaine spoke with her mouth full. Yeah, Mom. In truth, we've been doing the same thing, but I think we got into New Mexico a couple of days ago. Nicole's smile slowly faded. A couple of days ago? Well, why didn't you tell me? We figured you knew. Oh, yeah, I knew. The girls continued to eat the rabbit. Nicole smiled. Good job. She got to her feet and nodded her head. I'm proud of both of you. Julia smiled. What do you think? 600 or 700 miles to the Gulf? That sounds about right. 600 or 700 miles. Nicole's head nodded with a weak smile. She added a few more compliments and drew a deep breath. I'm going to bed down. Love you both. In the late afternoon of the next day, the trio strode through a lightly wooded area beneath a blue sky. A fresh breeze cooled their faces. The women rounded a large shrub and froze in their tracks. Not more than 40 yards ahead, 2 large dogs lay in the shade of a large oak. Transfixed, Nicole, Shemaine, and Julia watched. Slowly, one of the dogs turned to face them in a passive, relaxed manner. Nicole spoke softly. When it turns away, move behind the bush. Not spoken softly enough. The animal's ears tensed as it rose to its feet. A handsome face sat atop a massive body. Wolf-like, it had glossy chestnut fur and a majestic mane. The animal watched. Nicole whispered, He doesn't have our scent. The wolfish ears folded, its back hair bristled, and curled lips exposed white fangs. The other dog, lying on its side, faced away from the women. However, his companion's movements alerted him, and his head rose to gaze across his body. Only in his black color did his appearance differ. A growl from the tawny dog brought him to his feet. An oak tree stood near and behind the women. Nicole whispered again, Start moving toward the tree behind us. Move slowly. Without further discussion, the girls took slow, deliberate strides backward. The dogs, with their heads down, growled while taking slow steps toward the women. With the attack in progress, Nicole spoke in a loud voice. "Keep going." The girls proceeded. Nicole held her position, and the dogs halted at the apparent challenge. Nicole shouted, "Run for the trees!" She scooped a handful of rocks and dirt and threw it at the animals. Startled, the dogs stepped sideways and backward to avoid the stones. The girls bounded, as if on springs, onto a lower branch and situated themselves to assist their mother, now running toward them. The dogs quickly recovered their composure and made for Nicole at full speed. Nicole jumped at the tree, her right foot finding a grip on the bark as she reached for the extended hands of her daughters. However, Nicole's foot slipped from the tree, and she dropped to the ground. Her left ankle twisted on an exposed root, and she groaned in pain. Nicole struggled as the girls pleaded frantically, "They're close! Hurry!" Nicole stood on one leg and reached to her daughters. They gripped her hands tightly, and Nicole rose into the tree as if freed from gravity. The girls pulled her high, and at the apex, Nicole twisted and sat on a stout limb next to Shemaine's feet. The girls immediately climbed to the next limb higher. The action was quick, though for Nicole things moved slowly. She sat in the tree, her left foot and ankle numb. Below, the tawny dog leaped at her dangling legs and fell back to earth. Nicole watched as he recoiled and used the momentum to push himself upward with even greater force. Nicole awaited the rising beast with its open mouth and instinctively tried to pull her feet higher. Only her right leg complied. All three women watched in horror as the tip of Nicole's shoe entered the animal's mouth. The dog's jaws snapped shut, and it yanked its head viciously. Nicole's mind blurred with the agony. The dog lost its grip and fell back to earth. Nicole screamed as she fought to keep herself on the limb. Below, the dogs, with less energy, leaped repeatedly. Unsuccessful, they growled in agitation. Shemaine's voice trembled in panic. "Reach up! We can get you higher!" Nicole extended one hand to Shemaine and the other to Julia. The girls pulled, and Nicole rose to the next limb. She leaned against the branch and extended her left leg toward the trunk. Shemaine, leaning against the trunk, bent down to steady the injured ankle. Nicole's face contorted in agony. "I think something's broke," she moaned. "The pain is making me sick." Her eyes fluttered. "Loosen the laces." Shemaine straddled the limb and undid the ties. For the rest of the day and all through the night, the dogs kept the women at bay. They prowled about the base of the tree and occasionally barked or growled. At night they fell silent. A night of extreme discomfort followed. No position afforded relief on the narrow branches. Nicole fought spasms of nausea, and any movement caused pain. The night moved with irritating slowness. Prior to dawn, the dogs again paced about the tree, noisy with hunger. It wasn't until mid-morning that they conceded. After a last bark and growl, they trotted off to the north. Nicole lay slumped, exhausted from the pain in her ankle and her branch-tortured back. Her head wobbled, and she moaned with each breath. Julia looked at Shemaine. "How do we get her down?" Shemaine frowned. "First she has to sit up." She called to her mother. "Mom! Mom! It's time to get out of the tree." Nicole's eyes opened partially. Shemaine pleaded, You have to sit up. Nicole bent forward weakly. Right. Shemaine helped Nicole lower her legs from the branch. The position change intensified her pain, and she swooned. Shemaine instructed Julia. The faster we do this, the better. Get next to her and help her stay steady. Julia climbed to Nicole's branch and straddled it. She reached out to Nicole's slumping form and held her steady. Shemaine lowered herself to the limb below and looked up. Mother, come on now. We need your help. Nicole looked around, trying to comprehend. The girls waited in silence. Nicole took a few deep breaths and raised her head. Okay. What do you want me to do? Shemaine extended a hand. I'll guide your right foot to this branch. You have to lower yourself until you're standing on this branch. She paused. Do you understand? A moment ticked by. Mom, did you hear what I said? Yes. Nicole paused another moment. Okay, I'm ready. Let's do it. She leaned backward and rolled to her stomach as she slid down. Julia steadied her, and Shemaine guided her right foot to the lower branch. Nicole stood on one leg, her arms and chin resting on the vacated branch. Julia lowered herself to her mother's side and looked at her sister. Now what? Shemaine didn't say anything. Nicole took a few more deep breaths. I feel weak. Help me over to the trunk. Holding on to the limb, her injured foot dangled, and with the help of Julia, she took little hops to the trunk and leaned her back against it, one hand still on the upper limb. Shemaine dropped to the ground and looked up. Mom, can you lower yourself to a sitting position? Nicole closed her eyes to surging pain. Her right leg quivered. She opened her eyes and looked down at Shemaine. It was a good 10 feet to the ground. She grabbed the tree trunk behind her with both hands. Julia watched apprehensively. You can do it, Mom. Nicole allowed her hands to slide down the rough bark of the trunk while lowering herself with only the strength of her right leg. Without warning, her right leg collapsed. Her bottom hit the lower branch with her right buttock. She slid off and struck the back of her head on the limb. All went black. Shemaine caught her as her feet hit the ground, and both fell in a heap. The girls made a litter from small saplings. They cut up some of the fishing line to support Nicole's weight between the poles and used their backpacks as cushions. When placed on the litter, she lay quiet, in total exhaustion. The girls stood side by side and bent down, each grabbing a pole. Shemaine looked at her sister. South and some kind of shelter. Julia simply nodded. They slowly dragged the litter for the rest of the day and then deep into the night. No place of refuge was found, and the girls, at their limit of endurance, stopped for a rest. The rest became an all-night sleep. Shemaine opened her eyes at first light, lying next to Nicole's litter. She sat up and studied her mother's face, and then turned her attention to Julia, who lay on the other side of the litter. Julia, wake up. Julia woke with a start. Is everything okay? Shemaine arched her back. Mom seems okay, but the left side of my back is killing me. The girls got to their feet and took breaths of cool air, strong with the scent of water. Beneath their feet, lush green grass cushioned their steps. Standing at the top of a small knoll, Shemaine took a few strides toward the rising sun and scanned the area. At the base of the knoll, a small pond shimmered in soft light. Shemaine beckoned Julia to come and look. Julia walked to her side. "Oh, this is nice." The pond sparkled increasingly in the rising sun, and large willows graced the far shore, their droopy arms touching the water. Mallard ducks cruised at the near end, while a small doe drank near the willows. The girls contemplated the beauty as the sun rose and warmed their chilled bodies. A breeze skimmed the pond's surface, and slender water reeds swayed with a whispering hiss. Metallic dragonflies hovered and dashed about the waters, and butterflies fluttered like bits of painted paper in the blossom-sprinkled grass. Small birds darted in and out of the willows, their voices tiny chirps. The deer at the far end of the oblong pond finished its drink, raised its head, and stared at the girls. Julia nudged her sister and nodded toward the deer. The doe backed out of the pond, turned, and waved a fluffy white tail. Leisurely, with high prancing steps, it moved toward a nearby wooded area and stopped at the edge. It swung its head again to look at the women. The creature's motion, provocative, stepped into the forest shadows. Shemaine blinked with a sigh. "Let's get Mom to the water." She pointed. "Over there, where the deer was drinking." She turned back to the litter. Julia stepped backward with a continued stare. At the litter each hoisted a pole. Nicole stirred and opened her eyes. Her ankle throbbed when the litter moved. She couldn't see the pond, but she could smell its morning dampness. Her left hand fell to the side of the litter and brushed through the cool grass. Her mind calmed and mused a sensation of sanctuary. Julia whispered, "The deer was a little girl. I think she spoke to me." Shemaine nodded. They dragged the litter down the slope and headed for the other end of the pond. Shemaine inhaled a deep breath. "This place is clean. A nice nature clean." Her nostrils flared. Freshness. At the far side of the pond, they placed Nicole in the shade of the willows. Nicole still rested, her eyes closed. The girls strolled to the water's edge and removed their shoes. They entered the water until they were knee-deep, splashed their faces, and swallowed a cool drink. Shemaine removed her shirt and soaked it in the pond. She smiled at Julia. "You go ahead and wash up. I'll start cleaning Mom up." She turned away without waiting for an answer. Nicole awoke and raised herself on one elbow. She watched Shemaine approach with the sodden garment. Shemaine knelt before her mother. Nicole smiled. "My head's fuzzy." She lay back and looked into Shemaine's eyes. "You two must have been carrying me?" Shemaine patted her face with the wet cloth. "Yes, and we found a nice place to rest. It really feels nice." She moved to Nicole's injured foot and removed the shoe. Later, after building a fire and boiling water, Julia ventured into the forest where the tiny deer had vanished. A small trail led through the thick brush. The very narrow trail required that she step with one foot precisely in front of the other. After a short distance, a little clearing opened up. Julia stepped into it and slowly turned a tight circle of inspection. Most conspicuous was a house-sized rock nearly 50 feet high and almost as wide. The stone's face had a hollowing in it, like a small amphitheater, but deeper and certainly ample enough to afford reasonable shelter. Julia rushed back to the others. "I found some shelter, just a little ways from here." She pointed toward the forest, "just beyond the brush." Shemaine followed Julia to the place. The forest formed a thin canopy over the clearing, allowing a few pleasant rays of sun to filter in. The soil was sandy and sparsely spotted with tall grass. Julia repeated her tight circle, her arms extended out. "This place is glorious, absolutely glorious." Shemaine touched the rock. "Nice. This is very nice." She turned to Julia. "Let's get Mom over here, and then we'll set up a campsite." The enclosure gave the women a much-appreciated feel of security. Shemaine gathered leaves and grass for bedding. Julia went down to the pond, caught a grasshopper for bait, and soon had a trout dangling on the end of a fishing line. She caught 2 more fish, which they roasted for dinner. The ideal nature of the place became evident in the succeeding days. Berries grew in the sun, mushrooms in the shade, and a little deeper into the wood wild asparagus stabbed at the sky. Another gift came in the form of honey oozing from a crack in a nearby tree. The hive was higher up inside of a hollow, and there was never the problem of an annoyed bee. As the days passed, Nicole's injured foot improved. The swelling went down, though the skin color remained purple. Nicole was soon hopping around on a staff. The location, accommodating in so many ways, took on an air of mystery. "4 weeks hence, after adequate rest and sufficient food, Nicole's injury healed, though it was still painful when applying her full weight. The healing extended to the entire family, refreshing them mentally and spiritually. They even gained a few pounds. One evening, after a dinner of rabbit, the family sat around the remains of their cooking fire. They took turns sipping tea out of their 1 tin cup. Nicole took a drink and passed it to Julia. "My foot's pretty well healed. It's just going to take a little more time and exercise." She reached down and rubbed the ankle with her right hand. "No telling what I did to it." She straightened and smiled. "I can walk." Julia sipped the tea. "There are a lot of bones in an ankle, aren't there?" Nicole again reached down to her foot. "Yes, a bunch. It's tender when I squeeze it near the instep." She sat up straight. "It may never be perfect, but it'll be okay." Shemaine threw a twig on the fire and changed the subject. "This place. I remember people talking about energy vortices, special places with special powers. Do you think this place may be something like that?" She looked at her mother. "An energy vortex?" Nicole's eyes squinted. "I know what you mean." She paused a moment in thought. "There is energy here." She paused again. "I can feel it at night when I settle down to sleep, and then again in the morning, but never during the day." Julia raised her eyebrows. "Sounds like Matthew," she smiled, "with his special people and places." Nicole reached for the tea. "At any given moment I don't feel special, but when I look back at what we've been through," her voice cracked, "we keep surviving. How many behind us have died?" She put the cup of tea on the ground. Julia stared into the fire. "Makes me think of religion." She turned to her mother. "You and Dad were never involved in any religion, were you?" Shemaine stood up. "Where did that come from?" She walked over to her sister. "But, now that you bring it up," she turned to Nicole, "I always felt kind of funny about it. Everybody was something, Baptist or something. I didn't know what to tell people." Julia looked at her sister. "You know what I used to say?" She smiled, and her head tilted to the right and then to the left. "Oh, me, I'm a little this and a little that." Her eyebrows went up, but they always gave me a strange look. Shemaine chuckled. "A little this and a little that?" Julia spoke with mild annoyance. "Well, what did you tell them?" "I told them that I didn't belong to an organized religion." Julia bantered. "So, you belong to a disorganized religion?" Shemaine smiled. "Julia, you're beyond hope." Nicole picked up the cup of tea. "We raised you to understand that a higher power existed, but we wanted you to have the freedom to choose a religion or not." She paused and took a sip of tea. "When you were old enough, and hopefully wise enough." Nicole looked at the girl's inquiring eyes and anticipated their next question. "I was raised a Catholic, not in a very strict way. I lost interest when I was in college." "Your father was raised Protestant, and he gave it up when your grandparents died." Nicole smiled. Shemaine reached over and took the cup of tea from Nicole. "So, how does all of that fit into all of this?" She swept her right hand through the air. "Our situation? This pretty little speck in the middle of hell?" Nicole took a deep breath and smiled. "Ask me 10 years from now." Another month passed, and the daylight hours grew longer. The women guessed the time of year as near spring. Nicole's injury improved to a point. Pressure at the ball of her foot caused pain, and she sometimes hopped on her heel. On a clear moonlit night, the trio awakened to the dreaded sounds of howling dogs. Though terrifying for the girls, Nicole was calm. "It's time to leave this place." She smiled. "You remember, the settlement in the south?" Shemaine squeezed her mother's hand and whispered, "Other people." "Right. Time to leave." Julia whispered, "How close do you think the dogs are?" Nicole lay back on her bed. "We'll pack up and leave tomorrow. There's no protection here from dogs." Nicole rolled to her side and fell asleep. Shemaine and Julia could scarcely believe their ears and eyes. They huddled near their mother quietly and slept intermittently. At sunrise they ate a quick breakfast. Julia gathered a few things and stuffed them into her sack. "We can always come back, if we want." Shemaine hoisted her own pack. "No, we don't come back. We find the place." Julia looked at her mother. Nicole sighed. "We find the place." Once packed, they rounded the pond and climbed the same slope they descended on the day of their arrival. On top, they turned for a last look. From the path that led to their campsite, a tiny deer emerged into the open. Julia, delighted at the appearance. "It's the same deer. I'm sure. I'm sure." It stomped and nodded, and then bolted around the far end of the pond and disappeared into a thicket. 3 mallard ducks took flight, made a tight circle around the waters, and flew over their heads. A strong wind swirled the middle of the pond, and the water reeds hissed and hushed. Nicole turned and hobbled off. "How does that song go?" "On the road again. Just can't wait to get on the road again. The life I love is making music with my friends. I can't wait to get on the road again." Shemaine leaned toward Julia and whispered, "Let's hope she doesn't start singing 'The Hills Are Alive' with the sound of music." Julia muffled a laugh. "Remember when Dad made us watch that movie?" She took a deep breath and hefted her pack. "You know that settlement might be a lot closer than we think." Shemaine followed her sister. "Wouldn't that be nice? A few days and we could be eating omelets again." Shemaine went to her sister's side and nudged her with an elbow. "The new place may be big enough to have cheese and pizza." Nicole spoke over her shoulder. "We've been dining on fresh trout, wild berries, and mushrooms. Do you know what a meal like that would cost in Seattle?" Shemaine smiled at Julia. "No, but I'm sure it's more money than we have." Nicole chuckled and turned to the girls. "Keep your eyes, ears, and noses tuned to water." She took a few more steps and mumbled to herself, "I wish we could carry more." Nicole touched the knife dangling at her side on a strip of dried rabbit hide. A spark of panic flickered through her mind. Weapons, our weak point. We have to find that place, and soon. She added weight to her injured foot, testing for pain. Knowing that time was not on their side, she tried to move faster. At the end of the day, Nicole grimaced. Pain dimmed her spirit, and she chewed a piece of dried fish while she slumped against a tree, her weight on one foot. Julia watched. "There's not much taste to that stuff. I wish we had some salt." Shemaine sat on a log and tinkered with a small stick. "How's the foot feel?" "Not too bad. I'm going to try and make some sort of a cushion for it." She looked at the foot. "I think I can move faster with a cane or something." She grimaced. "I should have taken the one at the pond." Julia got up. "I can find you something." She pulled her knife and headed for the nearby brush. Nicole followed her with her eyes. "Stay close. In sight." Nicole slid to a sitting position. She picked up a piece of bark and tested it for flexibility. Shemaine watched. "We're moving very slowly." Nicole flipped the bark into the air. "I know, and that's not very good." She shook her head. "Time is against us." Shemaine crossed her legs. "We've lost a lot of time today, backtracking out of that little canyon, and again when moving around those rocks." Nicole jerked her legs straight out. "Shit, I got a cramp." Shemaine uncrossed her legs. "Do you want me to rub it?" No, it'll be okay." "Mom, I've got an idea." She crossed her legs again. "Why not let me and Julia take turns going out ahead to find a good path? We could avoid doubling back." "No, we stay together." "Mom, where's the greater danger? If we keep going this way, the trip will be twice as long, maybe even 3 times as long." Julia joined the conversation. "She's right, Mom. Her idea could help a lot." She walked out of the brush with a stout, short branch. "I think this'll work." She handed it to her mother. Nicole got to her feet and walked around, testing the cane. "Oh, that is better. Much better." She sat back down and took a deep breath. "I'll think about it." Her eyes met the stares of her daughters. "I'll sleep on it." For the first 2 days, the new strategy went well, and their progress improved. On the 3rd day, a storm brought their travels to a halt. They found shelter beneath the overhang of a cliff. It kept them dry, but little else. For 2 days they sat in the cold and dampness. After the last drop fell, they wasted no time moving on. They endured much on their trek from the ranch in the north. Their bodies were muscled, their minds keen, and most importantly, their spirits accepting and confident. They would have scarcely recognized the delicate creatures they once were. On the third day after the storm, the women got a late start. Julia knelt on one knee and kissed her mother on the cheek. "We get closer every day," she smiled. "We're going to make it. I can feel it." Nicole hugged her with one arm. "Don't take any chances. We're just trying to save time." Julia, with a sweet smile and a final wave, dashed into the bush. Shemaine hefted her pack. "I bet we're close." "I think you're right." She looked up at her daughter. "Put your pack down. We have a few minutes more." Shemaine dropped her pack. "Yeah, I'm anxious today. I wish it was my turn to lead." A few minutes later, Nicole stretched out her legs and looked into the high blue of the sky. A vulture circled and flew to the south. Her eyes closed in a meditative moment and then popped open, a startled look on her face. She got to her feet and Shemaine followed her lead. Nicole took a breath to say, "Let's go," but instead she let the air silently seep out of her mouth as she heard the sound of barking dogs. Nicole grabbed the knife at her side and turned to Shemaine. "Restart the fire and start another. She's not far off. I'll bring her back." Nicole grabbed her cane and ran into the brush, ignoring the pain in her foot. Shemaine stood transfixed, staring after her mother. She bit her lip and dropped her pack. Her hands shook as she gathered pieces of wood. 5 minutes from camp, Nicole feverishly zigzagged through the brush, wondering whether to shout Julia's name. She halted and sucked a quick breath at the sight of blood in her path. A short distance farther, she came upon a small knoll surrounded by a sun-baked meadow. The horror in the meadow etched a picture into her soul and produced a pain that would never leave her, a pain that would find relief only in its future familiarity. Chapter 13. Rest and Waiting. Justin. Justin and his children continued their trek southeast, moving through the high country of New Mexico. They trudged through a scrubby desert, sweltering at day and chilling at night. But soon the upward path led into the mountains, and tall ponderosa pine shadowed the travelers in the heat of day. The terrain permitted easy travel and security with less exposure. However, food gathering was tougher. At midday the family sat beneath a very old, stout pine after a morning of good progress. However, tired in an overall way, their stops were more frequent and longer. Not having found any sign of the settlement, and haunted by the flight of the missiles, their enthusiasm diminished. Michelle sipped water, and the men ate piñon nuts roasted the day before. She tossed a pine cone at Paul. "How long have we been on the move?" Paul grumbled. "Are you kidding? Forever. Maybe longer." He reached for her water. "You mean since we left California?" Michelle lay back on a small patch of dry grass, her head close to the tree trunk. She gazed up into the huge, majestic branches. "Why don't we take a break? Set up a shelter? Rest a while? Eat a lot of hot food?" Minutes went by with no responses. Justin thought of objecting, but said nothing. Paul rested on one elbow. "I've seen a number of caves. Perhaps we could find a big one. Set up some nice beds." Michelle, encouraged, sat up. Yeah, a supply of wood that would last a week, and a good supply of food as well. Paul turned to his father. With rest we could move faster later. His head tilted. We need the rest. Justin still said nothing. Inwardly, his aged body pleaded for rest. He had pushed himself hard. Michelle continued. We could set up a base and scout into different areas. We can't be very far from the coast. Paul faced his father. She's right, Dad, and I'm ready for a rest as well. It feels right. Justin smiled. Okay, resting time is here. We do it. A 4-day search produced an adequate cave midway up the side of a canyon wall. The canyon, closed at one end, gave the family a sense of security. They settled in. They made a rapid adaptation to their rocky shelter. Each picked a niche to personalize and reestablished simple comforts long denied. A warm and dry enclosure and solid separation from the dangers roving the land were accommodations absent since leaving Winchester Bay. The days combined into weeks. The cave totally occupied the interest of the travelers. They produced soft beds and comfortable chairs that sat near a cozy fire that didn't require a person to be within burning distance of the flames. A large pile of wood sat against a stony wall, and a store of food cooled in the deep end of the cave. Time was available to make use of hides for clothing and night covers. By the time their stay had extended into months, the interior of the cave exhibited comfort, ingenuity, and dedication. They swelled with pride at the achievement and fantasized about other possibilities if tools were available. A small fire crackled near the entrance of the cave. Paul dozed in the comfort of a lounge seat constructed of tree limbs lashed together with strips of hide. Michelle sat on her bed and punched small holes in a piece of leather. Justin prepared strips of venison for drying. He looked at the fire. I'm going to start cooking these strips. He bent toward Michelle and smiled. I'm sure the smell will wake Paul. Michelle smiled back. He's been like a bear halfway into hibernation. She punched another hole. I wish we had some pasta, or a potato, a piece of bread. Good old carbohydrates. Justin jammed skewers of meat into holes drilled into soft rock. I could go for some good old fat. This meat is so lean. He stood up. Look at us. He rubbed his hand over his stomach. Lean, mean machines, fit and trim. He laughed. I want some fat, a big wad of fat. Let it sizzle and save the grease. Michelle punched another hole. A goose, a big fat goose. Paul opened his eyes. A pig, a wild pig. There might be one of those about. Justin looked at his son. Give this meat a chance to cook, he smiled. We might find pigs farther south. Justin ambled to the cave entrance. He looked to his left and right. Speaking of the south, it's time to do some scouting. He turned to look at his kids. Paul stretched and leaned forward to study the cooking meat. Yeah, it's time. I feel very refreshed, and now I have fat on my mind. Justin moved to his lounge and sat down. Okay, let's see. He thought a moment. A week's trip to the southeast, moving fast. Michelle dropped the hide and went to her chair. The way I feel, I could do it on a run. Justin adjusted his decision. We'll do a 2-day trip out, and 2 days back. There were no disagreements. The trip resulted in an uneventful week. There were no signs of humans or the settlement. Before returning, they climbed a high peak for an aerial survey. The only thing of interest was a large body of water to the east. Its far sides weren't visible. Justin handed the field glasses to Michelle. "That's a very large body of water, but it can't possibly be the Gulf of Mexico." Paul used his hands to shade his eyes. "Why not? What else could it be?" Justin thought a moment. "Nah, we couldn't have moved that fast." Michelle handed the glasses to Paul. "If we are in New Mexico," she pointed toward the water, "then that's Texas." Paul spoke with the glasses at his eyes. "Or was Texas." Justin rubbed his chin. "Shit." He paused. "Something must have changed." Paul handed the glasses back to Justin. "Well, it doesn't mean the place doesn't exist." "True, but I was hoping for some sort of indicator." Michelle turned and started down the slope. "Let's go home." Paul followed her. "Don't worry, Pop. We have the rest of our lives to find it." Justin took up the rear and chuckled. "Well, I guess that's the right attitude." As they retraced their steps, they planned another expedition, this one directly to the south, and as Paul suggested, a 2-week trip, and possibly to the coast. The cave bestowed a genuine calm upon the family. They talked lovingly of it, and their returning steps were unconsciously faster. They felt a sensation that related to their other home, but then the emotion was vague. Now the feeling was sharp, intense, and very apparent. Back at the cave, the family's next endeavor was to replenish their stores. During a hunting venture into the lowland desert, Michelle stepped on a cactus. It was avoidable, a matter of haste and thoughtlessness. She awakened in the middle of the night with the need to relieve herself. In a rush, she scampered into the surrounding brush barefooted. A portion of the spines broke off beneath the skin, and the hunt ended with Michelle hobbling back to the cave. In short time, the embedded thorns produced festering sores that required periodic lancing. Justin canceled the scouting trip. The injury persisted for over a week, and the food supply dwindled to a very low level. They didn't want to leave her, but the food needed replenishing. So the men planned a 1 or 2 day hunt. Michelle understood the need, but felt anxious at being left behind. Paul and Justin entered the cave with a load of wood that they dropped near the entrance. Justin walked over to Michelle. "That should be enough wood for a few days, just in case we get hung up." Michelle looked at him. "No getting hung up. No getting hung up." She paused. "Do you hear me? No getting hung up. We leave in the morning. With luck we'll be back soon, and I promise we won't get hung up." Paul took a swig of water. "Our being here has chased the game a little farther away, but I don't think we'll have to go far." Michelle looked down at the ground. "I don't like this." Late that night the weather changed and rain fell. By morning, a robust wind canceled the hunt.